Welcome to the Israel-Palestine Report with Professor Alon Burstein. We are going to be talking today, October 25th, about what has been going on in the last week in the Israel-Hamas War, and specifically in the Gaza Strip. We're going to look at the breakdown of the ceasefire, what actually happened at the beginning of the week, and then the return of the ceasefire, and is it in fact still in effect? We're also going to be talking about the implementation of phase one, how many hostages have been released, how many bodies of hostages still remain, what is the status on that, as well as the entrance of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip and the opening of the Rafah crossing. We are then going to also address what is going on in the Gaza Strip as far as Hamas is rebuilding its military strength, rebuilding its government power, as well as the Israeli military's deployment in Gaza. And we're going to spend a lot of time actually talking about how the United States is trying to essentially compel both sides into going forward with the deal and implement the second phases of the deal, which involve the deployment of the International Stabilization Force, this multinational military force in the Gaza Strip. And we're going to talk about how the United States has actually set up a center in Israel that's supposed to coordinate the logistics of this, and militaries from around the world have been coming. Israel is going along with this, but is not leading the efforts. What does that mean? And what does this tell us about the possible trajectories of the deal, the war, and etc.? Before I go any further, I am going to say thank you to all of the people who have said throughout the week, especially the breakdown of the ceasefire. I got a lot of messages of people saying, why aren't you doing more videos? Where are the lives? We need to know what's going on. Thank you, everyone, for sending those messages. I will say, a personal note, I actually moved this week. Moved into a new house, so that is one of the reasons that I have been completely MIA for the last week. That is also the reason why, as you can see, there are no maps set up yet behind me. I'm going to be setting up my office and the recording areas in the coming days, but for now, unfortunately, we have nothing but the blank walls behind me, and if I occasionally say I want to look at the map, oh right, actually it's not there, you now understand why. And also, as I often say, I have two little kids, so if I appear tired, two little kids, and a move this week, that is what has been going on. As usual, I'm going to touch on these four topics that I talked about. I have prepared some notes about what I want to discuss. If you have any questions, please feel free, ask them as I go along, but I implore you, write question in front of the questions so that I can distinguish them as I'm quickly reading between the different comments. I can distinguish them from all the other comments, such as people suggesting that I have a housewarming party online, Mazel Tovs on the new house, and others that are saying that I don't need to apologize about the children. I know I don't need to apologize about the children. It's more a general apology. But having children is a wonderful thing and also can make one appear very, very tired. So sort of a general, like, I know I look tired. It's not an apology, more an explanation. So, unless there are any specific questions, if anyone wants me to address something specific that has happened in the last week that I did not say that I'm going to talk about, feel free to write that into the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to just dive into what I thought we should discuss when it comes to what has happened in the last week. And a little bit more than usual, I'm going to be looking at some notes that I've made because all of the reasons that I said before, I'm a little bit more frazzled than usual. So, starting with the ceasefire, the breakdown of the ceasefire. What has happened in the last week? The ceasefire itself, the truce between Israel and Hamas, slightly came out of nowhere. It was basically something the United States forced on both sides, the United States on Israel and Qatar and Egypt on Hamas. But if we would go back to August or July, it did not look like that's where things were going. And that's important. This was not a gradual buildup between the sides leading to an agreement and a ceasefire. This somewhat came out of nowhere. And therefore, the sides have not really been prepared for how this is going to be implemented. Therefore, we had the release of the hostages and a truce of the first week, but it's very not surprising that within a week or two, we start to have cracks in the foundations and we start to see that the ceasefire had at least its first official breakdown. But as we're going to talk about, it's not just one breakdown. It is happening on a low level and regrettably, or somewhat raising concerns, slightly increasing over the last several days. The major breakdown happened on October 19th, on Sunday of this past week, What happened was in an area in Rafah, which is the most southern city in the Gaza Strip, and very, very importantly, is an area that is entirely controlled by the Israeli military. So this is not an area that is under control by Hamas. It is an area that has been controlled by the Israeli military since, it depends how we look, but for certainly since March of this year. Some would say even further, some would go even further. It depends when we mark the different lines that the Israeli military drew. But since March, the Israeli military drew the Morag corridor, and since then, Hamas has not had an official presence there. On October 19th, there were 3 different violent incidents that occurred in Rafah, in the most southern city in the Gaza Strip. The first was a unit of Palestinian operatives, and I explicitly am saying Palestinian operatives and not Hamas because Hamas is denying that it took responsibility for this. Palestinian operatives emerged from a tunnel in Rafah and launched anti-tank missiles at Israeli military engineering units that were operating in that city. This was followed up by a Palestinian different unit that carried out a sniper attack. And then, after that, a gun battle also emerged. So 3 different incidents that occurred in Rafah. 2 Israeli soldiers were killed in those incidents, and the importance of the fact that this happened from within the area that's controlled by the IDF is that Hamas and its military wing, the Al-Qassam brigades, immediately said, we don't have a presence there. If you want to enforce security there, that is on you. That is not on us. This was not organized by Hamas, and we cannot be expected to control anything in that area. I'll get to the responses that happened in a minute. The retaliation. First of all, the Israeli government immediately announced that it is going to cut off all humanitarian aid that is coming into the Gaza Strip. And it said that humanitarian aid is coming as a result of the agreement that includes a truce between the sides. The truce has been violated by Hamas, and therefore it is cutting off all humanitarian aid. And then we had a massive retaliation of airstrikes throughout the Gaza Strip. There were major bombings that happened in Jabalia refugee camp in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip. There were also firebelt bombings that were reported in Han Yunis. That is very, very intensive bombings. And the reason they're called firebelt bombings is because essentially what they are is a ring of bombings that happen going closer and closer into a circle such that no one can actually escape. The idea is if you're targeting an area, you have a bombing like this, then a bombing like this, and a bombing like this, so that you cannot escape that area. We had that happening in Han Yunis. Reportedly over 30 bombings happened in that attack. There were also major airstrikes that were reported in the Al-Mawasi refugee camp, but that's also critically important because the Al-Mawasi refugee camp is the humanitarian zone in the Gaza Strip. And finally, we had an assassination that took place in the Azaweda area, that is in the central parts of Gaza. According to reports, that assassination targeted a coffee shop, and it targeted Yahya al-Mahouh, who is a Nukhba command fighter. Yahya al-Mahouh is a Nukhba platoon leader. That is Hamas's commando units in the central parts of the Gaza Strip. In that specific assassination, he was killed alongside 10 more Palestinians. And in total, between 15 and 20 Palestinians were killed in those airstrikes that were reported throughout the day. During this time, during this flare-up, the United States and negotiating parties immediately jumped in and immediately tried to de-escalate the situation. We had Hamas putting out several different statements denying any responsibility for that attack in Rafah. Izzat Arishak, who is one of the Hamas leaders, he's part of Hamas's political bureau, openly said that Hamas has nothing to do with this and is committed to the ceasefire. And somewhat more importantly, the Al-Qassam brigades, the militant wing of Hamas, put out an extensive statement saying, among others, I quote, "We have no knowledge of any incident or clashes taking place in the Rafah area, which is a red zone under the Israeli occupation control." So again, we have the Al-Qassam brigade saying, this has nothing to do with us, and you cannot come to us with any grievances about why this has happened in that area. It continued to say, contact has been cut between our group and any operatives in those areas since the war resumed in March of this year. Soon after this also, the Al-Qassam brigades put out another statement saying that they have located the body of another hostage and will return it that evening based upon what happens in the field. I'll talk about that later when I talk about the implementation of phase 1, but all those things were the attempt of Hamas to deny any responsibility for that attack that took place in Rafah and basically say, we cannot be expected to control any such attacks. Don't come to us and now stop Israel from any such retaliation. I will say, in a moment of analysis, that it is highly unlikely that Hamas had nothing to do with that attack. That attack was highly coordinated. Again, a triple attack that involves both anti-tank missiles being fired from a tunnel, as well as backup sniper units, and then an ensuing gun battle, is something that requires a lot of coordination and likely would not be carried out by just quote-unquote local operatives. I'll also say that this is somewhat of a known tactic of Hamas. It goes back even 30 years. During the Oslo agreements, whenever the Israeli military withdrew from a certain area and handed it over to the Palestinian Authority, Hamas would carry out attacks from that area. So Hamas would not carry out attacks from that area. It would then carry out attacks from different areas and say, don't come to the Palestinian Authority with any grievances. They have no control. We're carrying out attacks solely from the areas that are under Israeli military control. So you cannot complain, why aren't the Palestinians stopping this? So admittedly, that's 30 years ago, but at the same time, it is somewhat of a well-known tactic that Hamas has used in order to say, we can carry out attacks, but also can have complete deniability that any of those attacks have anything to do with us. Again, I'm emphasizing that's speculation on my part. Hamas denied any responsibility. I have no knowledge that they actually were responsible for that attack, but in my own analysis, it is unlikely that they had nothing to do with that, or didn't at least know that it was likely going to be carried out in that day, on that time, in that area. With this flare-up that was happening between Israel and the Al-Qassam brigades, the United States also swung into gear. And Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who are the two people that are most involved from the United States with the negotiations, immediately spoke to Israel's Minister Ron Dermer, who is the person who is by far the closest confidant to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. And they stated the United States would like to see a measured retaliation. The United States recognizes that Hamas violated the deal, but it does not want Israel to now say, okay, all bets are off and we're going to war. In Israel, there were some cabinet members that were tweeting, war, we're back, it's all over. The United States made clear it does not want to see any such thing. It also made clear that it does not want to see Israel break all of the previous agreements, such as related to the entrance of humanitarian aid, and wants Israel to retaliate, but then go back to implementation of the deal. It is important that several hours after that conversation, Israel very, very tacitly backed down from that statement that it is now stopping all humanitarian aid from coming into Gaza. The Israeli Prime Minister's office put out a different statement, and it said that humanitarian aid was stopped throughout the day due to the escalation of the bombings, but the minute that's over, then humanitarian aid is going to again resume. And very clearly, that was a result of that conversation. By the end of the day, I'm still on October 19th, still on Sunday, by the end of the day, Al Jazeera reported that the negotiating countries are working on a new mechanism that is going to address future violations of what is happening between Israel and Hamas. And that's going to become important for the fourth thing I'm going to talk about, what is happening in the implementation of phase 2. I'm just bringing that up here. I'll get back to that. All that is a result of what happened on Sunday. By the end of the day, it was declared that the truce is restored. However, despite the fact that the truce is restored, we are seeing more and more incidents that are happening throughout the week. If we compare this to last week, where there were relatively minimal incidents, over the last week, on Monday, gun battles were reported in Sajaiya. This is the northern parts of Gaza. 2 Palestinians were reportedly killed, and the Israeli military then announced that Palestinian operatives had approached the yellow line, that is the line the Israeli military has withdrawn to, and accordingly they were fired upon. On Tuesday, the following days, day after day, there was another incident of a Palestinian reportedly trying to cross the yellow line. The Israeli military reported it was a terror operative. Palestinian sources reported it was a random civilian. He was also shot and killed. On that same day, on Tuesday, October 21st, explosive devices were detonated in Han Yunis, in the areas that are controlled by the Israeli military. 2 Israeli soldiers were injured, and airstrikes were reported in that area. And there were a couple of other low-level incidents. And then on Saturday, today, there was also artillery fire from the Israeli military that was reported in the Al-Nuseirat refugee camp. This is the central parts of the Gaza Strip. According to Palestinian sources, a division commander of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad was the one who was a target of that attack, and he was in fact assassinated, and 6 more people were killed in that attack. The Israeli military put out a statement saying that that attack took place because that operative was planning an imminent attack against Israeli soldiers. This happened several hours before I recorded this, so it is possible that we are going to see now a reaction of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad or of Hamas. Remains to be seen. What is important to take away as I conclude this first section of the breakdown of the ceasefire, that it's restoring and where we are now, what is important to take away from this is the fact that the ground is starting to shake under this truce. This truce, again, was pretty much forced on both sides. And while the first week, both sides broadly adhered to it, now coming into the second and third week, we are seeing that Hamas, again, Palestinian operatives, but I would estimate that Hamas had something to do with that, violated that at the beginning of the week. Now we have the Israeli assassination that took place at the end of the week. Seemingly, we're seeing that there is shaky ground with regards to this truce. And this is going to come up again when I start talking about how the United States is trying to move the deal forward and the concern in the United States that it's going to break down. But again, that's the first thing that I wanted to talk about. So I'm going to stop here and look at questions when it comes to the situation of the truce in the Gaza Strip. I am now looking back at some of the questions. Thank you to people who are writing, "You demand, Professor." Good evening, Professor. Thank you for people saying where they're coming from. Someone puts in a statement. "Professor, thank you so much for these videos and insight into the Middle East. Greatly appreciate your thoughts." Thank you, Thomas from Australia. Always wanted to go to Australia. Maybe one day. Okay, I'm looking at some of the questions. Okay, so one question coming in from Warrior V3U. Why do you think J.D. Vance is upset with the annexation? So this question is relating to the vote that was passed in the Israeli parliament with regards to the annexation of the West Bank. In the Israeli parliament, in the Knesset, there was the first phase of passing a law that says that Israel is going to annex the West Bank. And this happened specifically when the United States Vice President, J.D. Vance, was visiting Israel. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but one of the reasons that he would be upset at this is this explicitly goes against something that U.S. President Trump said. Trump is often quite vague when it comes to statements as to how things are going to be implemented. He has now, I'm going to talk about this soon, given Hamas a 48-hour window to make advances in returning the bodies of hostages. That's unclear. Does that mean they have to return all the bodies of hostages or only some? Trump is deliberately vague in these things in order to allow wiggle room as things move forward. When it comes to Israel annexing the West Bank, Trump was strangely, or not strangely, given his array of alliances in the Middle East, explicit. And he said that he will not allow Israel to annex the West Bank. It's not going to happen. Then, when the Vice President of the United States is visiting Israel, during that visit, the Israeli parliament votes in its first round of voting to annex the West Bank. That is seen as a slap in the face to U.S. President Trump, and that is likely the reason why Vance would have been upset at that. But again, I'll talk about that in a moment. I'm looking if there are any other questions that people have written. Anything else coming in, feel free again to write in any questions, regardless of how far-fetched they might be. Okay. So, with that, again, let me know if I've missed any questions. With that, I'm going to go to talking about the second thing that I wanted to address with regards to what has happened in the past week in the Middle East, specifically in Gaza Strip and the Israel-Hamas War, and that is the implementation of phase 1 of the deal. Again, the deal between the sides, I've said this many times, anyone who's followed me knows this very well, my statement. I have many times said that the 20-point plan that U.S. President Trump put forward should not be viewed as a plan. It should be viewed as a framework. It's a framework for how the war should be resolved. Some might argue how the entire Israeli-Palestinian conflict should be resolved. That's not going to happen in a 5-page, 20-point plan. That is a vision. The plans actually have to be worked out and negotiated with much more detail. Therefore, when it came time to actually implement this plan, it was divided into several phases. And the first phase, and that's what we're in right now, related to the release of all living hostages that were held in the Gaza Strip, the return of the remains of all dead hostages that are held in the Gaza Strip. This would be in exchange for the release of Palestinian prisoners that are held by Israel, and the return of the bodies of Palestinians that are held by Israel. Also related to the redeployment of the Israeli military in the Gaza Strip, as well as the entrance of humanitarian aid and the opening of the Rafah crossing. All those things have to do with the implementation of the first phase, which again, we're in now. And one of the examples that I said before that Trump is often vague, one of the examples is there's no time frame. Is this supposed to all be concluded within a week, 3 weeks, a month, 6 months? No time frame in the negotiations between the sides or in the 20-point plan. So we've had the release of all the living hostages. There's no more living hostages in the Gaza Strip. And right now, there is dispute over the return of the remains of hostages. We've had the return of 15 bodies of hostages thus far. Several more were returned throughout the week, bringing us now to 15 out of the 28 have been returned. And there still are the remains of 13 hostages, the bodies of 13 hostages held in the Gaza Strip by different organizations. When the deal was signed, Hamas said that it will have difficulty retrieving the remains of between 8 to 10 hostages, saying they don't even know where they are due to the extensive bombing that happened in the Gaza Strip. And since then, they said that they have difficulty getting to the other remains because they are under massive buildings that have collapsed or been bombed out by the IDF. And Hamas has required that heavy industrial equipment, i.e. tractors and bulldozers, be brought into the Gaza Strip in order to excavate those bodies. Israel has denied this and has said, no, Hamas can get to those bodies without this equipment. That's been the stalemate between the sides with regards to the return of the bodies of hostages. Then we also have the entrance of humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid began to flow into the Gaza Strip immediately when the truce was called. It has gone up and down based on these developments, and specifically, like I said, on Sunday, Israel announced that all humanitarian aid would be cut off. Then it was restored again on Monday. So that has gone up and down, but broadly, there has been the increased amount of humanitarian aid coming into the Gaza Strip. Not as much as was promised in the initial deal. Israel is saying that it is not going to allow the initial promise of 608 trucks per day until Hamas lives up to its side and returns the remains of all the hostages. However, that is flowing at a much higher rate than was in the past. Then we have the Rafah crossing. The Rafah crossing is the only land crossing between Gaza and a place that's not Israel, which is Egypt. All other crossings, the land crossings, sea and air, are controlled by Israel. The Rafah crossing is a crossing between Gaza and Egypt. It is right now controlled by Israel since Israel took over Rafah, but historically, since between 2005 or 2007 and 2023, it was not controlled by Israel. According to the initial deal, phase one, the Israeli military is supposed to withdraw specifically from that crossing, and it's supposed to be opened based on a mechanism that would be worked out between the sides. Since then, both sides have said very different things about what that mechanism will include. The Palestinian side and also the Egyptian side, the Egyptian governor of northern Sinai, has said that the mechanism that will be in place in the Rafah crossing is going to be that same mechanism that was agreed between the sides in 2005. That means representatives of the EU are going to be in the Rafah crossing alongside representatives of the Palestinian Authority. Palestinian Authority that is headed by Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank. They're going to send representatives to the Rafah crossing. Israel denied this because in Israel it is politically explosive for Netanyahu to agree that the Palestinian Authority will have any footing in the Gaza Strip, and said, no, it's going to be local Palestinians that Israel vets and agrees to, that they're going to be the ones who man the crossing. I will say again, in a moment of analysis, it is very, very likely that the deal is actually going to be the Palestinian Authority and the EU that is manning the Rafah crossing and in charge of who goes between Gaza and Egypt. But in Israel, likely it's just too politically damaging for Netanyahu to say that. That's, again, my own analysis, no insider knowledge of that. Since the implementation of the deal, however, the Rafah crossing has not been opened. There's still no way to get in or out of the Gaza Strip. There have been several grand announcements that the Rafah crossing is going to be opened and that there's going to be a flow of people that are allowed to leave Gaza and those who come into Gaza, vetted by Israel, not vetted by Israel. However, since then it has not been opened. Israel has said again that it's not going to allow the opening of the Rafah crossing until Hamas lives up to its side of the deal, which is the return of all the remains of hostages. This is coming under increased pressure of the negotiating countries, including the United States, to allow the opening of the crossing and the entrance of both heavy industrial equipment and goods into the Gaza Strip. But for now, at this point, the Rafah crossing remains closed. So, just summarizing this, when it comes to the implementation of Phase 1, with regards to the hostages, all the living hostages have been released, and the remains of 15 out of the 28 hostages that have been killed and their remains are held in the Gaza Strip have been returned, leaving, as of now, the bodies of 13 hostages in the Gaza Strip. Israel, in turn, has released close to 2,000 living Palestinian prisoners and returned close to 300 bodies of Palestinians that have been held by Israel. That's the one aspect of Phase 1. With regards to the truce between the sides, as I talked about before, the truce is being broadly maintained over the last several weeks, but is starting to be on increasingly shaky grounds. The Israeli military has withdrawn and redeployed to the yellow line, which again, I would show if I had my maps up. So it has withdrawn to the yellow line. And we have had an increase of humanitarian aid coming into the Gaza Strip, but not quite at the level that was supposed to come in based upon the deal. Then, with regard to the Rafah crossing, we have substantial disagreements between the sides as to what should be the mechanism that allows people to come in and out of the Gaza Strip. And partly as a result of that disagreement, and partly as a result of Israel simply saying it's not going to allow the Rafah crossing to open until Hamas lives up to the deal. As of now, that is the one aspect of the deal that has entirely not been lived up to, and the Rafah crossing remains closed as of this time. Pausing now, I'm going to look at some of the comments and questions that have come in thus far. People are talking to me about Australia because I said that I would love to go to Australia. I would love to go to Australia. It just seems like one of these places that you should go to some point in your life. Although Fran is saying there's huge spiders in Australia, and I do have serious arachnophobia, so that's probably why I probably will never end up there. But I should at some point. Questions that have come in. So, one of the questions, there are reports of 4 militias operating in Gaza, armed and funded by Israel. How are they faring against Hamas? So, I'm going to talk about this in a moment when I talk about what's happening in the Gaza Strip. But I will say broadly, those militias that are operating in the Gaza Strip, some of them are funded and armed by Israel. Some of them are not, and they're just being allowed to operate and function within the areas that are controlled by Israel. Israel seemingly has an interest to prop up these militias because they're counterweight against Hamas. In my last video, I stated that when we look historically, anywhere from Afghanistan to Iraq to Syria to Yemen to Algeria to Libya, the list goes on, countries that try to prop up militias as a counterweight to any form of sub-state actor, nationalist, religious, or whatever, it tends to not end well. However, at this point, Israel is still protecting those militias. With regards to the question of how are they faring, at this point, not that well. Hamas is fighting them. There was a report I'm going to talk about soon within the Israeli military that suggested that even though they are seen as a nuisance to Hamas, they're not actually threatening the Hamas's rebuilding and governing power. They do exist, and there could be twists of history where they would become more prominent within the Gaza Strip. But at this point, they are seen as more of a nuisance and something that is a thorn in Hamas's side when it comes to rebuilding, rather than an actual threat to the Hamas government in the Gaza Strip. Another question coming in from Hammer122. Does the Trump plan include a division between Eastern versus Western Gaza and the presence of 2 governments simultaneously in the Gaza Strip? Excellent question. I don't know if you are referring specifically to a report that came out that the Trump administration is considering dividing Gaza along the yellow line from east to west. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but in theory, with regards to your question, no. The Trump plan does not talk about the division of Gaza. On the contrary, the Trump plan explicitly talks about the continuous withdrawal of the Israeli military from the Gaza Strip. Does not say exactly the timetable as to when this will happen, but the Israeli military, according to the plan, is supposed to withdraw from the Gaza Strip once the area is considered terror-free, something else that's quite vague, that might have to be discussed at some point between the sides. And then it's supposed to be taken over by some international force, which I'm going to talk about at length, the International Stabilization Force. And then this is all supposed to become one territorial unit again, the Gaza Strip, that is going to then be redeveloped and rebuilt for the good of, according to the plan, the Gazan people, specifically all the Gazan people as one unit. So there are some reports that the Trump administration is talking about maybe starting to develop one side of Gaza versus the other. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But in the plan itself, it's supposed to be one indivisible unit. Pausing a minute to take a drink and giving people a chance to throw in other questions if they have. Thank you, Becca, for suggesting that I hydrate. I've mentioned that that my students in class have always laughed at the fact that I can go through basically half a gallon of water during a lecture. And I don't want to move my camera, but you could see the array of drinks that I have set up here on the side. It would probably make several people laugh. And giving 1 to 10 more seconds if there are any more questions coming in about what the implementation of phase 1. Next thing I'm going to talk about is the situation in the Gaza Strip. What is happening meanwhile while all these things are going on the ground? What is actually happening? And then I'm going to talk about looking forward to the attempts of the United States to actually drive the second phase of the plan forward. So then that's what we'll talk about in a moment, but giving people another chance to ask any questions. Becca is calling upon people to hit the like button. Well, thank you. I always like to have freelance agents out there. So indeed, feel free to hit that like button. If you like this, if you have any other comments, feel free. Okay, so next thing I'm going to talk about. Meanwhile, what is happening on the ground in the Gaza Strip? And specifically, as has been suggested here, there's two different areas in the Gaza Strip. There is the yellow line, which is the area that the Israeli military has withdrawn to that controls roughly 55% of the Gaza Strip, 55%, 58%, honestly depends who you believe, but it's between 55 and 58% of the Gaza Strip. And the rest of the territory that is controlled, in theory, not supposed to be according to the deal by Hamas, but de facto by Hamas, that is rebuilding in that area. So what is happening? In the areas that are controlled by the Israeli military, that is again considered within the yellow line that the Israeli military is redeployed to, there are two things that are happening. One, the Israeli military itself is continuing to operate in those areas. It is continuing to excavate and destroy tunnels within those areas, again, Rafah, parts of Han Yunis, large parts of Gaza City. It is continuing to fight Palestinian operatives in those areas that are still armed. And it is doing a lot of other things, such as marking out territories in future corridors that it plans to actually remain in, like the buffer zone, or other military operations of that nature, as well as looking for the remains of hostages that might be in those areas. So in the areas that are controlled by the Israeli military, all that's going on. But most people are more concerned with what is happening in the other areas. The other areas of the Gaza Strip, primarily the areas that are adjacent to the coast. That is the Al-Mawasi refugee camp, the areas of central Gaza, Deir al-Balah, as well as the associated refugee camps, and the southern parts of Gaza City, as well as the northern areas of Han Yunis. What is happening in those areas? So, firstly, Already when the Israeli military redeployed and withdrew from those areas, Hamas, as I mentioned in my last video, immediately deployed its own security forces in those areas and began assuming control. This has increased over the last week, and by October 22nd, in the middle of the week, the Israeli security establishment put out an intelligence report that said that Hamas is working very, very effectively to establish its civilian control in those areas in the Gaza Strip. Among others, it is said that Hamas has reestablished its municipal services. It is the only one that is operating as any functional bureaucracy when it comes to coordinating the mass amounts of humanitarian aid that's coming in, or coordinating any rebuilding efforts, or any efforts to at least clear the rubble from the different areas in the Gaza Strip and start zoning out areas for refugees and internally displaced people to come in. So all that's being run by the municipalities that are affiliated with the Hamas administration. Hamas has also started to collect taxes again, something that Hamas stopped doing because it could not effectively do. Since the war broke out, it has now started again to collect taxes from merchants within those areas in the Gaza Strip, as well as increasingly installing its own version of law and order that is also enforcing a police force to theoretically just enforce law against criminals. But primarily what that means is hunting down people that are suspected as collaborators with the Israeli military, as well as fighting militias in the Gaza Strip. All that's to say that the civil administration of Hamas, reestablishing its control of municipalities, tax collection, as well as making sure that it is the only one that has any measure of enforcing the law and order, the only one that is allowed to have a police force and stopping essentially any warlords from coming up and assuming control of a territory in Gaza, is something that Hamas has been doing very effectively. An even more, I'll say, some might say concerning, some might say damaging report came out on October 20th, on Monday. And this was a report of the Israeli military with regards to what is the strength of Hamas's military. It has now been 2 years since the war broke out. The Israeli military has thrown absolutely everything it can at the Gaza Strip. And the question is, so what is Hamas's current military strength? And this report, I'm going to say again, is fairly damning when it comes to the Israeli military successes. According to, again, the Israeli military's intelligence, Hamas's military strength as of now includes roughly 20,000 fighting operatives that Hamas can mobilize within the Gaza Strip. When the war broke out, it was estimated that Hamas had between 25,000 and 30,000 fighting operatives. Since then, the Israeli military said that it killed between 15 to 20,000 of them. However, Hamas has recruited new operatives, trained them, and now the estimate is that it has some 20,000 fighting operatives. The Israeli military also estimates that Hamas's military wing, the Al-Qassam brigades, has hundreds of rockets, including medium-range rockets that can reach central Israel, thousands of RPGs, that is, rocket-propelled grenades or anti-tank missiles, over 10,000 guns at its disposal with ammunition. It has also rebuilt its fighting divisions, such that it now has 6 divisions in the Gaza Strip and 24 semi-operative battalions. The report says these are not fully functional battalions like an established military like before the war, but semi-functional. And the report also says that over half of the tunnels that Hamas had built prior to the war remain operative. So 2 years into the war, the Israeli military is saying this is the strength of Hamas's military wing: 20,000 fighting operatives, hundreds of rockets, thousands of RPGs, over 10,000 guns, 6 divisions, 24 semi-functional battalions, and over half of the tunnels are still in operation. Now, what this means with regards to where things are going, there are several things that we need to understand from that, I would say. Firstly, Hamas isn't going anywhere with regards to its presence in the Gaza Strip. And this relates back to the question I was asked before about the militias. The militias in the Gaza Strip are armed. They're very well armed, some of them by Israel, some of them armed from within the Gaza Strip. At best, each militia includes between 100 and 300 operatives. Possibly all of them grouped together are maybe 1,000 to 1,500 fighting operatives. That is not a match for Hamas in the Gaza Strip. It also tells us something with regards to Hamas's ability to carry on the war. There is this expectation, because Hamas has been striving for ceasefire, that if the fighting resumes, Hamas will just be destroyed. And US President Trump has repeatedly stated this. If he just snaps his fingers, Israel, the United States, or someone else is going to go in and finish the job, and Hamas will be destroyed. We've now had 2 years of very intensive fighting in the Gaza Strip. At the end of those 2 years, this is a situation of Hamas's military. So that also tells us something about the ability to just eliminate Hamas through military force. It also should tell us something about Israel's demands for disarming and demilitarizing Hamas in the Gaza Strip. This is not something that is just about collecting a few guns in Gaza. It's not something about just decommissioning several hundred fighters. This would have to be a massive operation that would include several different militaries probably, and that would include a lot of goodwill between the sides to agree on this and getting to some sort of understanding and some sort of agreement as to how this would happen. But it also tells us something about why Israel might be demanding this, because it has essentially failed to defeat Hamas militarily. The only way Hamas would effectively disarm would be if it would agree to disarm within this framework of a deal. I'll say also that, just as an anecdote, I wrote an article in the Times of Israel several months ago about Israel's successes against Hezbollah and Iran and its failure in Gaza. And this is what I was referring to, how with regards to Hezbollah and Iran, we had the achievement of a deal that essentially brought about some versions of victory for Israel. When it comes to the situation in Gaza, Hamas is not as strong as it was at the beginning of the war, but it's far from where you would expect, given the amount of fighting and bombs and military that has been thrown into the Gaza Strip. It's far from what you would expect the situation of a sub-state actor should be when facing the Israeli military. And pausing here, going to look at some of the questions that have come in with regards to what is happening in the Gaza Strip. Other questions that have come in. Who do you think will secure the area? Warrior asks. I'm not sure which area you're referring to. I presume the area that the Israeli military will withdraw from, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Blessings with your new house, and also blessings with your wife and kid. I will pass on those blessings. Thank you. Looking at questions. So a question that came in. My assumption is that Israel cut aid in the spring because Hamas promised aid parcels to families that sent young men to Hamas. Is there truth in that? So there's a lot of controversy with regards to the entrance of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip and how much Hamas was stealing and how much Israel should or should not have allowed aid to come into Gaza based upon that. Firstly, when it comes to the theoretical side, it depends what you're focusing on. When it comes to international law, Israel is required to allow humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip without any hindrance. That's international law, a blanket statement. The Fourth Geneva Convention says if you are an occupying force, you are required to allow aid to come into the area for the civilian population. However, then there's the international law also says, but if there's a security need to not do certain things, you're allowed to also invoke that. And then comes the question, so if Hamas is stealing large parts of the aid or some of the aid, is Israel still required to allow aid into the Gaza Strip? Israel said no. The International Court of Justice has said yes. So it depends on who exactly you're listening to. The international system, and specifically the United Nations, has put out report after report that has shown that Israel has failed to provide proof that Hamas has systematically stolen the aid that was coming into the Gaza Strip. A lot of the aid was stolen by the different militias, some of them supported by Israel, some of them not. A lot of it was looted by Palestinians, and a lot of them was stolen by Hamas. But according to, again, international law strictly, Hamas has not necessarily stolen all the aid coming into the Gaza Strip, and Israel should not have blocked aid, therefore, from coming in. Now, from the Israeli perspective, okay, but Hamas was stealing enough to stop aid from coming in. So it depends really who you would be listening to. There is an argument to be made for the side that says it is a security need to stop aid from coming into the Gaza Strip. And there's an argument to be made to say, yes, but despite the security needs, not all aid should be blocked because people are starving. So both sides have made both arguments. And again, it depends who exactly you're listening to. Other questions. I heard that many of the Hamas new militant fighters are 13 to 7-year-olds and not at a professional level. Is that true? Yes, that is one of the things that has been brought up. While Hamas has replenished its fighting forces in the Gaza Strip, these are not at the same level as the fighting forces prior to October 7th. A lot of them are young boys. A lot of them have not had adequate, so to speak, military training. And most importantly, a lot of them have not had the same levels of indoctrination. Those fighters that participated in the October 7th attack or were part of Hamas's fighting units when the war broke out had undergone Hamas's training, both military training, but also psychological and ideological training and indoctrination for well over a decade. Whereas the new recruits are not necessarily at that level. At the same time, a lot of them are people that have lost everything in the war, whether there are kids or not. They're 17-year-olds. They've lost everything in the war. Most of them have lost family members. And as a result, they may not have the same level of ideological commitment, but nonetheless, they are relatively committed to fighting Israel at this stage. So it is true they're not as well-trained fighters, but they are fighters that Hamas can send into battle. Other questions coming in. Following up on different question, do you have a notion as to how many children who died were also combatants? To be perfectly honest, I do not have those figures in front of me. There are different estimates as to how many people who were under the age of 18, that is what the level is considered internationally minors, were actually combatants. I actually do not have those figures in front of me, so I'll try to collect them for the next video. I'm sorry about that. Question, where does Israel want the Palestinian people to live? If not Gaza, where will they go? Warrior asked that. That is an excellent question with regards to the forced immigration plans that Trump had talked about in February, and since then Israel took off with. Now Trump is not talking about that anymore. In fact, the 20-point plan explicitly says that Palestinians will be encouraged to remain in the Gaza Strip. However, the theory, according to Trump's plan, is that there will be at least 7 countries that are willing to take Palestinians into them. Some reports were there was going to be areas in Somalia, other reports in Ethiopia, other reports possibly areas in Libya, other reports that maybe Indonesia, other reports, as you understand what I'm saying, lots and lots and lots of rumors, lots and lots and lots of reports. There is no country that openly said that we're willing to take Palestinian refugees, and at this point it does not seem likely that there's going to be a mass immigration of Palestinians out of Gaza. A lot of the surveys that have been conducted have said that lots of Palestinians would like to leave Gaza. It doesn't say though to where. And theoretically, leaving Gaza to Canada, the United States, the EU is probably something that a lot of Palestinians might sign on to. Leaving Gaza to war-torn Somalia or leaving Gaza to areas in Sudan or South Sudan, less likely is going to happen. Other questions, or this is a comment. Restricting commodity economic warfare has a problem. Okay, this is thank you, Larry. There is an equation here, a mathematical equation. Anyone who knows me knows that is not something I am even going to engage in. I am a qualitative researcher, not a quantitative one. I am pausing here and again going to hydrate before I get into the last thing that I want to talk about, which is actually the biggest development of the last week. So bear with me. If there's any more questions, I will try to field them. Then I'm going to dive into what has actually been arguably the biggest development of the last week, how the United States is planning to actually drive forward and force the implementation of the next phase. Alon is the absolute best analyst on Israel-Palestine. Thank you, sir. Thank you for the compliment. Robin Yahud, which is an awesome nickname and handle, I will just say, wants me to speak on E1. Forgive me, but I'm not going to do that right now because it is too complicated. Honestly, it's too complicated without a map to try to actually explain. But once I get my maps up, I will try to maybe even do a live session specifically about the West Bank. And there I'll talk about E1. But at this point, it is going to be too confusing for me even to try to explain that, let alone for others who are not familiar with the complex geography of the West Bank without a map. So forgive me. I'm not going to talk about that right now. So, question being asked, can the United States pressure Egypt to send in troops, considering they send lots of aid to them? Can they also get Turkey to send in troops in return for the kickstarting of the F-35 sale? Exactly what I'm going to talk about. Exactly what I'm going to talk about right now. The question of different countries possibly sending forces and troops to the Gaza Strip. So, the last thing I was going to talk about, and again, if you're bearing with me, you're going to see this might actually be the biggest development that has been going on, which is why I saved it for last, which is preparations for implementing phase 2 in the Gaza Strip. Phase 2 of the Trump 20-point plan is really the one that is supposed to take us past these temporary truces. What has happened until now in Trump's 20-point plan is not that different than what happened from the first ceasefire between the sides, the truce in November of 2023, when there was a truce and the release of hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners and entrance of humanitarian aid, or the beginning of 2025 in January, when there was again a truce, the release of hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners and the entrance of humanitarian aid, and the opening of Rafah crossing then. That is what's happened until now. Theoretically, right now, in terms of on the ground, this has not been different than the previous deals. What is theoretically supposed to be different is the follow-through. What happens next? Phase 2 of the deal involves a massive array of things, including Hamas disarming, the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip, the continual withdrawal of the Israeli military, the beginning of massive international investments into Gaza, the rebuilding of the Gaza Strip and looking towards the future, the Palestinian Authority undergoing reforms, taking control of Gaza, and again, further and further into the future. So, what is happening with regards to moving forward towards phase 2? First, it's important to note that the United States is being very, very explicit with Israel that it wants to move towards phase 2 regardless of the failures of phase 1. Phase 1, like I said before, large parts of it have been fully implemented. Large parts of it have not been implemented. Nonetheless, the United States has made clear it wants still to move towards phase 2. And we're seeing the United States and the negotiating countries, but really right now, this is all dependent on the extent of pressure that comes from the White House. We've seen the United States pushing both sides. On the one hand, throughout the last week, US President Trump has issued statement after statement threatening Hamas. He issued statements saying that if Hamas does not return the bodies of all hostages, he is going to snap his fingers and Israel will return to fighting and all hell will break loose, the famous gates of hell, and hell is going to rain down on the Gaza Strip. On Tuesday, Trump put out a statement saying that many allies of the United States in the Middle East have volunteered to go in and, quote, straighten out Hamas if Hamas continues to act badly and continues to violate the agreement. He also said that those countries, he has told those countries in Israel, not yet, but if Hamas does not live up to the deal, then, again, quote, an end to Hamas will be fast, furious, and brutal. On Sunday, Trump also issued another statement giving Hamas 48 hours to move forward with returning the bodies. So he's putting a lot of pressure on Hamas through these different statements. On the other hand, within the array of negotiators, the United States is quote unquote, supposed to put pressure on Israel, whereas Qatar and Egypt are supposed to put pressure on Hamas. And they have been. They have been putting a lot of pressure on Hamas when the deal broke down, or the truce broke down on Sunday. And they put a lot of pressure on Hamas to return more bodies of hostages. But the biggest development has been the pressure of the United States on Israel, because with the political alignments within Israel, there's a lot of concern that once the truce breaks down or Hamas fails to return the bodies of hostages, Israel will return to full-scale fighting, something the United States does not want to see. So after the breakdown of the truce on Sunday, we have had essentially a train of U.S. officials that have been flying to Israel to constantly ensure that the ceasefire holds. Within the last 4 days, we have had Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner fly to Israel, meet with the Prime Minister and with other officials, and we'll talk about in a minute. We also had the U.S. Vice President, J.D. Vance, fly to Israel, meet with the Prime Minister and a series of other people, and the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. All of them are coming to Israel, essentially to tell Israel, you do not have the U.S. backing to now say that the deal is over. They're all coming to Israel to mount heavy pressure on the Israeli government in order to not take the violations of the deal, as now the deal is over and we can return to fighting. So, with that, what have they actually done when they have come to the Middle East? We've had two channels in which the negotiating parties are trying to advance the situation. Firstly, like I said, Egypt has been applying pressure on the Palestinian side, Hamas, and other factions to come together and return the bodies of hostages, as well as come to agreements with regards to the mechanisms of implementing phase 2. And it is also important to note this has borne some fruit. We have seen the Popular Front of the Liberation of Palestine return the body of a hostage that happened in the middle of the week. We have seen the sides come together and agree upon the formation of who will be the Palestinian representatives of a future government in the Gaza Strip. It's important to note that the list of 15 people that the parties then submitted is likely to be rejected by Israel. According to some reports, Hamas had a lot to do with the putting together of that list, and that is not according to the deal. Hamas is not supposed to have anything to do with the government in the Gaza Strip. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about that later. But the Egyptian and Qatari side are trying to apply pressure on the Palestinian side. Meanwhile, within Israel, all of this pressure from the United States has produced something, the establishment of a new mechanism that was established within Israel that is supposed to drive forward the next phase of the deal. And that is associated with the establishment of the International Stabilization Force, the ISF. The International Stabilization Force is envisioned in Trump's 20-point plan as a multi-party force that is made up of the armies and soldiers of different actors in the world, including the United Nations, that is supposed to take responsibility for areas in the Gaza Strip that the Israeli military withdraws from. I'm looking specifically at the 20-point plan and what it says about the International Stabilization Force, because I actually wanted to read that out. And in a different time, I would have actually planned this in advance and not have to look for it right now, but I'm now flipping the page. And what Article, I believe, 17 of the 20-point plan says is, the United States will work with Arab and international partners to develop a temporary International Stabilization Force, ISF, to immediately deploy in Gaza. The ISF will train and provide support to vetted Palestinian police forces in Gaza and will consult with Jordan and Egypt, who have extensive experience in the field. This force will be a long-term internal security solution. The ISF will work with Israel and Egypt to help secure border areas along with a newly trained Palestinian police force. It is critical to prevent munitions from entering the Gaza Strip, to facilitate the rapid and secure flow of goods, to rebuild and revitalize Gaza. It also explicitly says that Israel will not occupy or annex Gaza. As the ISF establishes control and stability, the Israeli Defense Forces will withdraw based on standards, milestones, etc., etc. So the vision in Trump's 20-point plan is the establishment of an international force to gradually take control of areas in the Gaza Strip. That, like I said, is very vague. How is that actually being implemented on the ground? In the middle of the week, and now I remind you that when the truce broke down on Sunday, by the end of the day, Al Jazeera was reporting the negotiating countries are trying to come up with a new mechanism to try to work out these violations of the deal and make sure it does not break down. in the beginning of the week, with the arrival of Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, there started to be rumors that the Israeli military is developing some sort of logistical area in Israel. And on October 21st, on Tuesday, CENTCOM, the United States Central Command, announced that it is establishing the Civil Military Coordination Center. Civil Military Coordination Center, CMCC, is the abbreviation that is being talked about. According to reports, the CMCC, the Civil Military Coordination Center, is the mechanism the United States military and administration is planning in order to set up a logistical center in Israel to coordinate the efforts of humanitarian relief and the bringing in of these different militaries and armies into the Gaza Strip in order to allow the Israeli military to withdraw and these other armies to take control of territory in the Gaza Strip. In the announcement of the establishment, CENTCOM stated, and I'm quoting, "The CMCC is designed to support stabilization efforts in Gaza. U.S. military personnel will not deploy into Gaza, but will instead help facilitate the flow of humanitarian, logistical, and security assistance from international counterparts into the Gaza Strip." It also says that the Civil Military Coordination Center that was established in southern Israel in Kiryat Gat is meant to oversee the ceasefire. So it is established in Israel, but it is also a mechanism. The United States is going to oversee the ceasefire from both sides and ensure that it is not violated. It is also a center that is being seen as a logistical hub to coordinate all the regional efforts from Egypt, Jordan, Turkey, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain. All of these countries that have a lot to do with what is happening in Gaza is now going to flow through the Civil Military Coordination Center. On the same day that it was announced it was established, Egypt sent the head of intelligence, Hassan Rashad, to Israel. He met with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and also with the U.S. envoys in the area. Within 3 days, by October 24th, it was reported that within the CMCC, the Civil Military Coordination Center in Israel, that was established by the United States in Israel, there are soldiers already on the ground within Israel from the United States, France, United Kingdom, Spain, Australia, Greece, and Cyprus, and that there are also representatives of Jordan, United Arab Emirates, Germany, Canada, Denmark, as well as the U.S. ambassador to Yemen was sent to this area as though he was a representative from Yemen. More than that, on October 25th, U.S. President Trump stated in a meeting with the Emir of Qatar that Qatar might also be the one to send troops to the Gaza Strip, to the National Stabilization Force, if necessary. So, what do we have? What do we take away from this with regards to the implementation of Phase 2? We have these two channels that are happening. On the one hand, Egypt and Qatar are applying monumental pressure on Hamas to come to some sort of agreements with the different Palestinian factions, the Palestinian Authority, and the different factions on the ground in order to maybe theoretically agree to disarm and demilitarize, but more than that, just agree to move forward incrementally towards Phase 2 of the agreement. That has borne some fruit in as much as Hamas and other factions have agreed to put forth a list of the different Palestinians who might form a future government in the Gaza Strip. At the same time, I will say Hamas is not supposed to be part of that, so that's supposed to be something that Hamas has no involvement in, but that is bearing fruit with regards to the pressure of Qatar and Egypt. On the other side, we have the United States sending mass amounts of emissaries to Israel, high-level emissaries, basically everyone except for Trump himself. We had the vice president, the secretary of state. We've also had the special envoy, Steve Witkoff, and Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, all coming to Israel. Another thing I'll say is they have not met just with Netanyahu. They have gone, each one of them, have gone and have had meetings personally with the Israeli military. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner met with a series of Israeli generals. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance went and met with Israel's chief of staff, the head of the military, Eyal Zamir. That is unprecedented. That political emissaries from around the world are going to meet with the Israeli military, and according to reports, they are going in order to talk directly to the military, tell the military what the United States wants, tell the military how they need to prepare for phase two. That is very, very important. What we're seeing there is the United States essentially bypassing the Israeli government and the political establishment. Some have argued out of a complete lack of trust in Netanyahu. Others have argued different things. I'm not going to give my opinion on that. I am going to say that factually bypassing the Israeli government in order to talk directly to the Israeli military and say this is what's going to happen as far as we're concerned in the future of Gaza. So we have those list of emissaries that are coming to the Gaza Strip, but more than that, the establishment of the Civil Military Coordination Center, the CMCC, I am going to argue, is one of the biggest steps with regards to driving phase two forward and actually trying to ensure that this ceasefire takes hold, because unlike the previous deals that essentially relied on Israel and Hamas coming to some sort of agreement, this is now an indication that the United States and the negotiating countries, but essentially the United States, is intending to drive this deal forward, to some extent bypassing Israel and Hamas. Somewhat in the same way that the United States got this deal through. I remind everyone, this deal was initially proposed by the United States to a series of Arab and Muslim countries. Israel and Hamas were not invited. Arab and Muslim countries agreed with the United States. This is what's going to happen. When we had the peace conference where they declared that the war is over in Egypt, those who signed on to that were the United States, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, United States, say again, those who signed on to that are the United States, Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey. Those are the ones who signed on to the war being over. Those are not the sides that are fighting the war. The sides that are fighting the war are Hamas and Israel. This ceasefire was imposed on the sides by their different patrons, so to speak. And why I'm saying that the establishment of the Civil Military Coordination Center, the CMCC in Israel, is so crucial is because that is an indication that as far as the United States is concerned, it doesn't end with the first phase of the deal. The United States is still intending to continuously impose the continuation of the deal, regardless of the goodwill, so to speak, of both sides. Hamas violates the deal, Israel may violate the deal. The United States is establishing a center in Israel. It's sending its top emissaries to talk to the Israeli military directly, bypassing the Israeli government, and is essentially saying we are driving this forward regardless of what the fighting sides actually say. That said, I'm not saying it's going to succeed. I'm not saying that, well, therefore, if the United States is driving this forward, there's going to be peace between Israel and Hamas. The Israeli military is still one of the strongest militaries in the Middle East. The Israeli cabinet is still made up of people who very, very vehemently and explicitly have said if the country goes to a ceasefire, they're going to overthrow the government. They are advocating the continuation of the war. Hamas still has, as part of its agenda, war with Israel and has, as I said before, 20,000 fighting operatives and mass amounts of weaponry. So I'm not saying if the United States just drives this home, well, then it's going to succeed. But it is telling us something with regards to what might be the future of the way things are going to play out. Whether that future actually plays out towards a continuation of the deal or this breaks down and the United States continues to try, we don't know. But it does tell us something about what we're likely to see in the next week or two with regards to what's happening on the ground. We're going to see the development of the CMCC becoming more and more important. Maybe Israel and Hamas cooperating, maybe only one of them cooperating, maybe not. But that is essentially going to be, I would argue, the big story of the upcoming week. With that, I am going to now take a look at some questions as I hydrate. Let's see questions. Scrolling back up. Question coming from Raven Force. Can the United States... Oh, sorry, this was a question before. Can the United States pressure Egypt to send troops into the Gaza Strip? So again, I hope I addressed that to some extent. The United States has a lot of sway, but this would require also Israeli consent. Depends on how that pressure actually plays out. What is the capital of Palestine? Who were its leaders of old? What currency did it use? Oh, sorry, this is not a question. This is a comment between people about Palestine. Question. Phase 2 looks like occupation by an Arab or Turco League army. Will Gulf Arab economic blandishment be sufficient to prevent Gaza from becoming locus of anti-Israel military force? So that is one of the things that actually Hamas has brought up. Hamas has said it is not going to accept the presence of another non-Palestinian force being in the Gaza Strip as essentially another occupier. That said, you actually implied that, Crab Lewis, in your question. It is very likely that with massive investments from Qatar, Bahrain, possibly United Arab Emirates, the civilian population in Gaza will want to see the rebuilding as opposed to a return to fighting. How that will play out very much depends on how each side actually organizes itself with regards to if the rebuilding is done for the interest of the population or if it's done for the interest of the local countries that are funding. That remains to be seen, but it is likely that the population will be interested more in the rebuilding. But Hamas is saying, yes, this is just another occupier, and that's why we're not going to accept that. Becca says it's wild to see JD Vance actually do something. No comment. Let's see what else. Other questions. Why aren't we seeing any official commitment yet from countries to the international force? Does this mean there is no final agreement yet about phase 2? So it's an excellent question coming from Hammer122. Why aren't we seeing countries actually commit to the international force? Among others, I would argue there's 2 reasons. One, we don't know what that force is still meant to do. Is it supposed to be a force that goes in and disarms and fights Hamas? Or is it more of a peacekeeping force in the Gaza Strip that is supposed to just be there to try to stop the sides from fighting each other? Is it also supposed to, in theory, fight Israel if Israel were to invade the Gaza Strip or not? We don't know. And thus, it is also very unlikely that countries would want to commit their troops to such a force without knowing what it's actually supposed to do. In addition to that, there's also the fact that Israel is very, very hesitant. Israel is a de facto military on the ground in the Gaza Strip. No one can enter into the Gaza Strip without Israel's approval. Israel is very hesitant to allow forces from Turkey, Qatar. Israel's also said it doesn't want anyone from France because France recognized the state of Palestine, and others from having a foothold in the Gaza Strip because it would also be very, very, very dangerous breeding ground for international incidents if fighting does flare up and an Israeli airstrike ends up killing soldiers, possibly from these different countries. So both those things are causing a lot of hesitation from countries to actually commit their troops to this international stabilization force. We'll see if the CMCC manages to come up with a formula that actually helps assuage countries' hesitation or not. That remains to be seen. Other questions? Questions people commenting about Yemen. Question, will Israel condition the withdrawal of the IDF to the demilitarization of Hamas? Do I see an IDF presence in Gaza in the foreseeable future? So Israel has continuously said that it's going to condition its withdrawal on the demilitarization of Hamas. I'm going to say again, I'm going to read the question again, sorry. Will Israel condition the withdrawal of the Israeli military on the demilitarization of Hamas in the Gaza Strip? So Israel has said repeatedly that it is not going to withdraw unless Hamas is disarmed and Gaza demilitarized. In the last 2 days, Israel added a more refined clause to that and said it does not want the rebuilding of Gaza to start until all the tunnels are destroyed. So Israel is definitely making noise saying that it is not going to withdraw unless there's a complete disarmament, demilitarization of Gaza. That said, I'm also going to add, if the United States compels Israel to withdraw at this point, it is possible that it will be successful. We are seeing that Israel does not have a leg to stand on when it comes to the pressure from the United States to go forward with any one of its threats. Israel said it's not going to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza. It said it's not going to redeploy in Gaza until all the bodies of hostages are returned. It said a lot of things. Currently, what the United States tells Israel to do, seemingly Israel is doing. So Israel may condition that, but will that actually hold? That remains to be seen. Other questions? Good that seems to be seen as Israel. Okay, these are a lot of comments between people, which I'm glad that there's room for debate here. who do I think will be the next prime? So, question: who do I think will be the next prime minister of Israel? I'm going to decline to answer that. It depends if and when there are elections in Israel. Okay, I think I'm going to give another couple of minutes here. I'm going to give one more minute to see if there are any more questions. Otherwise, people can feel free to comment among themselves. Okay, so with that, I am going to conclude this live stream. Thank you, everyone who has joined. In case this is the first time that you are seeing this, this is the Israel-Palestine Report with Professor Alon Burstein. I am a professor of political science and an Israel Institute fellow in the Department of Political Science at Tufts University. Hit that subscribe button if you want to know when these reports come out. I sometimes do live streams. Sometimes I do recordings. Sometimes I upload interviews that I have. If you have any questions, feel free to also add them in the comments below. I try to address as many of these as possible, but I will say that, like you've heard me say, I have 2 little kids, and I've just moved, and I'm a professor in the university, so there's a lot of obligations. So if I miss any of your comments and do not address them, please forgive me, but do feel free to jump on a live stream and ask them again. And with that, thank you, everyone, and have an awesome week.